The westbound accommodation put Melinda Prine down on the platform at Hesper, Nebraska at 7 minutes past 4 on the afternoon of the 11th of September, 1879, and the town had been standing on that platform since 2:30. Because every soul in it knew what was coming off that train, and not one of them intended to miss it. Hesper was 4 years old, and it was one street. It had a depot with a red roof and a coal shed and a stock pen, a bank in a frame building with a false front, a store, a hardware, 2 saloons, a livery, a church that was also the school, and 11 houses that had been built on purpose, and about 30 more that had been built in a hurry. It sat where the Burlington branch came up over the divide and dropped down toward the Turkey Creek bottoms, in a country that had been buffalo grass 8 years before and was wheat now, all the way to the sky in 3 directions. And it had a bachelor of some property named Lyman Teal, who owned the steam mill and who had sent east for a wife. That was the whole of the entertainment. He had made no secret of it. He had been a widower 6 years, he had a good house with a bay window in it and a hired girl to keep it, and in the spring he had answered an advertisement in a matrimonial paper out of Chicago, and there had been letters going back and forth all summer, and by August he had told 3 men at the bank that the matter was arranged. And by the first week of September there was not a woman within 9 miles who did not know the date and the train. So they came in. They came in on horseback and in wagons and on foot, and by 4 o'clock there were something better than 90 people on and around that platform, in their second-best clothes, standing in the heat with the grasshoppers going in the dry grass along the right-of-way, and a good many of them had brought their dinner. Lyman Teal came down at 10 minutes to 4 in a gray sack coat and a black tie and a hat brushed that morning, with his watch chain across him and his boots blacked, and he stood up at the head end of the platform where the sleeper would stop if there had been a sleeper, and he shook hands with the station agent and said something that made the agent laugh. And he stood there with his hands behind his back, and he was, by any measure anybody in that town had, a fortunate man having a good day. He was 41 that year. He was tall, and he carried himself well, and he was going a little heavy through the middle in the way of a man who had stopped doing his own lifting. His hair was fair and thinning and combed straight back, and he had close side whiskers and pale blue eyes and a heavy square jaw, and he had come out from Ohio in '72 with capital, which in that country, in that decade, was very nearly the same thing as being born to a title. The train came in 11 minutes late and stopped with the baggage car door about where the crowd was thickest, and the brakeman put down the step at the second coach. And Lyman Teal walked down to it and took his hat off and stood at the bottom of the steps with his hand up, which is what a bridegroom does, ready to hand his bride down onto the platform of the town he had built a good part of. A drummer came off first with a sample case. A woman with 2 little girls came off after him and was met. Then there was a pause of the kind that a crowd notices, and the conductor put his head out and said something back into the car, and the light in the vestibule changed, and Melinda Prine came into the doorway. She filled it. That is not a figure of speech, and it is the plain first fact of this story, and it will be set down here once, plainly. And then it will not be gone over again, because she would not permit it to be gone over in her hearing for the next 52 years, and there is no call to do to her in a telling what nobody was let do to her in life. Melinda Prine was 24 years old. She stood 5 feet 3 inches. She weighed 327 pounds, and she knew the figure exactly, because her father's mill had a beam scale in the loading door, and she had stood on it every New Year's morning since she was 14, and written the number in the back of the mill book in pencil, in a column, under the heading her father had put there in 1869, which was one word, and the word was Melinda. She was broad through the shoulder and broad through the hip and thick everywhere in between, and there was a great deal of hard muscle under it that you could not see until she picked something up. Her arms were heavy and round, and they ended in short, wide hands with square fingers, and the palms of those hands were yellow and glazed like the horn of a hoof. And there were black flecks under the skin of them that will be explained further along, and that are the most important thing about her. Her face was round and full and high in color, with a deep double chin and a wide mouth and small dark eyes that did not move around much. Her hair was dark brown and heavy, and she wore it pinned in a low knot at the back of her neck under a white cotton head cloth tied behind, which is not a bonnet and is not a sunbonnet, and which she wore because in a mill a bonnet brim catches on everything and a loose end of hair catches on one thing only, which is a shaft. And once. She wore a plain butternut brown dress with the sleeves rolled above her elbows because she had been on a train 4 days, and over it a long gray canvas apron with a bib and men's boots. She came down the steps one at a time, sideways, with her hand on the rail, the way a heavy person comes down a set of iron car steps that are made for somebody else. Lyman Teal stood at the bottom with his hat in his hand and his other hand up. And then he took the hand down. He did not take her off the train. She came off it by herself. That is the sentence this county could never afterward get around, and it is the one the children of the people who were there grew up hearing. And it was always said the same way, which was that her bridegroom would not take her off the train. There are 11 people who left an account of that minute, and they do not agree about very much. But they agree about that, because it was the sort of thing that a person who saw it did not afterward get to stop seeing. His hand came up, and he looked at her in the doorway of the car, and his face went through 3 different arrangements in about 2 seconds, and then his hand went down to his side and stayed there, and he stepped back 1 step, so that when she got to the bottom of the steps there was nobody there. She got down onto the platform and set her valise on the boards and straightened up and looked at him. He said, out loud, in a voice that carried the whole length of that platform because he was a man used to being heard in a room, "There has been a mistake." She said, "I do not think so." He said, "You wrote to me." She said, "I did, 5 times. And you wrote to me 6. He said, "You did not tell me." And she said, still quiet, still not moving, "Mr. Teal, I wrote it in the 3rd letter, and I underlined it, and I put in the figures so there could not be an argument about it. I told you I was a large woman, and I told you how large, to the pound, because I did not want either one of us standing on a depot platform finding it out." Lyman Teal said the sentence that he spent the rest of his life inside of. He said, "I took it for a misprint," and Hesper, Nebraska laughed. Not all of it. It is important to be exact about this, because in that town in the years afterward, a great many people wanted it understood that they had not laughed, and the truth is that a good half of them did not. But a crowd does not need all of itself. There were perhaps 40 men on that platform who let go at once, and it went up over the top of the depot and out across the stock pens, and once it was up, it was the only sound in the county. The station agent turned around and made himself busy with a truck. 2 women near the baggage room took hold of each other's arms and started away up the platform and did not get far because there was no room. A man at the back said something about weighing her in on the stock scale and getting a rate on her, and he got his laugh. And another man, a horse trader named Purdy Lovelace, said the thing that stuck. And it stuck because at that exact moment the baggage crew had the side door of the car open and were rolling something out of it on a truck. What they were rolling out was 2 crates. They were flat crates of 2-inch oak, bolted, not nailed, each one about 4 foot square and about 18 inches thick, and they came out of that car slow, with 3 men on the truck and 1 man walking backward, and when the first one came down off the plank onto the platform, the boards of the platform went down under it and came back up. Purdy Lovelace looked at the crates, and he looked at her, and he said, "Loud, boys, she's fetched her own tombstones, brought a pair of them too. She'll want the pair." That was the joke of the county for the next 15 months. It got carried out to farms that evening. It got told in Renshaw at the county seat inside of 3 days. It got printed in a softened form in the Hesper Vidette on the 18th of September under a heading that said Hyman's Freight Bill, which the editor of that paper spent the rest of his working life wishing he could go back and unset, 1 letter at a time. Melinda Prine did not look at the crowd while it laughed. She looked at the crates. She walked down the platform to where the second one was coming off the truck, and she said, "Ease it. Ease it down. Don't drop the corner," and one of the baggage men, who had been laughing 11 seconds earlier, eased it down without thinking about it at all. Because there is a certain voice that gets obeyed by anybody who works with heavy things, and she had it. Then she put her hand flat on the top crate and left it there for a second, the way you would on the neck of a horse. And then she turned around and looked at the town. She waited. She stood in the middle of that platform with her hands down at her sides and her chin level and no expression on her face whatsoever, no anger, no crying, no appeal to anybody, and she waited for them to finish. And she did not fidget, and she did not look at her feet, and the thing that got in under the ribs of a good many people on that platform, and that 4 of them wrote down years later in almost the same words, was that she was not enduring it. She was waiting on it. There is a difference, and everybody there felt the difference, and nobody there could have said what it was. It ran down the way they all run down. The men in the middle of it kept it up longest because they had the least to do. Then the train blew off and started and pulled out west, and the noise of it covered the last of the laughing and took it away, and when the caboose had gone by there was a silence on that platform that several people described afterward as the worst thing they had ever stood in. Lyman Teal had his pocketbook out. He came 4 steps toward her, and he took out money, and he held it out, and he said, and it is only fair to him to say that he said it low, and that his face was the color of a brick, "Ma'am, the fault is mine, and I will not make you argue about it. There is a train east at 10 minutes to 9 in the morning. I have paid your fare here, and I will pay it back, and I will pay your keep at the hotel tonight, and I will make you a present besides for the trouble I have put you to, and I would take it as a kindness if you would let me do it and say no more about it." Melinda Prine looked at the money. Then she said, "Mr. Teal, whose mill is that on Turkey Creek that is not running?" He did not understand the question. Nobody on that platform understood the question. It was as though she had asked him the price of wool in Australia. He stood there with his hand out with the money in it, and he said, "Ma'am," she said, "coming up from the south, the train crosses a creek about 5 miles below the town, and there is a mill standing on the east bank of it with a stone foundation and a hipped roof, and the head race caved in. And the dam is out, and there is a young cottonwood growing in the pond bed, so it has been out about 3 years. Whose is it?" And Lyman Teal, in the last decent instinct he was to have for some considerable time, answered her honestly, because he was rattled, and because answering a question was easier than standing there. He said, "That is the old Sherrill mill. Ozias Sherrill built it in 72, and the hoppers took him in 74, and again in 75, and the dam went out in the June rise of 77, and he give it up and went back to Indiana. It belongs to a mortgage house in Chicago now. Nobody wants it. There is not a man in this county would give $200 for the whole of it." Melinda Prine said, "Thank you." Then she said, "I will not take your money, and I would like you to put it away, because there are 90 people watching you hold it out to me, and every one of them is going to remember which one of us had their hand out." He put it away. She picked up her valise. She said to the station agent, not to Teal, "Those 2 crates are mine, and they are staying in your freight room until I send for them, and I will pay the storage on them by the week, in advance, and I will thank you not to let anybody lever them up on a corner to see what is in them, because if a corner of the top one goes down on this platform, it will take out about $11 of your planking and about $400 of my property." The station agent, whose name was Farrell Judd, and who was 26 years old, and who had not laughed but had not stopped it either, said, "Yes, ma'am." And she walked off the platform, down the steps at the end, and up the one street of Hesper, Nebraska, alone in the 4 o'clock heat, with about 90 people watching her go, and not one of them saying anything. And she went 11 steps before somebody caught her by the arm. The somebody was Hetty Dowd. Hetty Dowd kept the eating house next to the depot, which was one long room with a counter and 8 stools and 4 tables and a kitchen behind it, and she fed the section crews and the trainmen and any drummer who did not want to walk up to the hotel. She was 61 years old, and she was small and dry and about 90 pounds soaking wet, and she had white hair pinned so tight it pulled at her temples, and wire spectacles, and a face like a hatchet, and she had buried a husband at Shiloh and 2 children in Iowa, and had come out to the end of the branch line at 58 to start over, which was a thing that in 1876 a woman of 58 did not do. She had been standing at her own doorway through the entire performance with her arms folded. She said, "You will come in here and sit down." Melinda Prine said, "I have got $61, and I intend to keep the whole of it." Hetty Dowd said, "I did not ask you for any of it. I said come in and sit down, and I will tell you a thing about this town that will save you a month." So Melinda Prine went in and sat down, and that is how she came to be at a counter in a depot eating house in Hesper, Nebraska, 20 minutes after the worst public minute of her life. With a cup of coffee in front of her and a plate of beefsteak and fried potatoes she did not touch for a quarter of an hour, while outside the window the town went up and down the street telling each other what had happened and getting it wrong in 4 separate directions before the sun went down. The thing Hetty Dowd told her was this. She said, "There is not a man in this county will cross Lyman Teal to your face, and there is not 1 in 10 of them that likes him. He has got the mill, and he has got paper on about 1/3 of the farms south of here, and he buys wheat, and he sells coal, and he sits on the school board, and he holds the note on this building I am standing in. Now what he has got that matters is the mill. It is a good mill. It is steam, 40 barrels, and he grinds for the whole country from Kelso Ridge to the state line, and he takes toll of 1/5. Melinda Prine put her cup down. She said 1/5. Hetty Dowd said 1/5. Melinda Prine said, "Of the grain." Hetty Dowd said, "Of the grain, and cash on top of it if you want it bolted fine, and there is not 1 thing anybody can do about it, because the next mill is at Renshaw, and Renshaw is 31 miles, and 31 miles is 2 days with a load and a night in the wagon yard, and by the time you have fed your team and yourself, you have spent more than the toll." Melinda Prine sat there for a while. Then she said, and Hetty Dowd repeated this sentence to people for the next 30 years, and always in the same flat way that it was said. "The lawful toll in the state of Illinois is 1/8, and my father took 1/10 for 41 years and put his children through school on it, and there is no man alive who needs 1/5 of another man's wheat unless he is a fool with his own money or he thinks nobody is coming." Hetty Dowd said, "Nobody is coming." Melinda Prine said, "I am here." And Hetty Dowd, who had spent a good part of her life reading faces across a counter because there is no other way to run an eating house at the end of a branch line, looked at the young woman on the stool for a long moment, and then she got up and went and got the coffee pot and filled the cup back up, which was her way of signing a contract. Now it is necessary to go back a little, because everything that happened at Hesper in the next 2 years came out of a place in southern Illinois and out of 1 man, and the man had been dead 6 months by the 11th of September. Absalom Prine was a millwright and a miller on Skillet Fork in Wayne County, Illinois, and his father had been one before him in Ohio. And the trade went back behind that into Pennsylvania and behind that into Wales, and it was not a job in that family, it was a condition, like the color of the eyes. He built the mill on Skillet Fork in 1849, and he ran it until the March of 1879, when he had a stroke of paralysis on the mill floor at 11 o'clock in the morning and died at the end of the week without getting his speech back, at 66 years of age. He had 4 children. 2 died. One was a son named Wesley, who went into the Illinois Central as a fireman at 19 and had no use for the mill and never pretended to. And one was Melinda. She was in that mill from the time she could walk. Her mother died when she was 11, and after that there was nowhere else to put her, and by the time she was 13 she was tending the hopper, and by 14 she was keeping the book, and by 15 she could tram a spindle. And when she was 16 years old, in 1871, her father let her dress her first stone alone, and stood in the door with his arms folded, and watched her do it, and did not say one word for 4 hours, and then came in, and got down on his knees on the floor with his staff and his red keel, and went over the whole face of it, and stood up, and said the only piece of praise anybody ever recorded him giving to anybody, which was, "That will do." She was a miller, not a miller's daughter, not a woman who had helped at a mill. There is a difference, and every man in the trade knew what it was, and it comes down finally to a small, ugly detail that most people have never heard of and that decided this entire story, and it is this. A millstone does not grind by rubbing. It grinds by shearing, and it does that because the face of it is cut with a pattern of furrows and flat places called lands, and those furrows have to be recut every so often as they wear, and the flat lands between the furrows have to be finely scored, or cracked, with a set of very shallow parallel lines, so many to the inch, and that work is done by hand, kneeling on the stone. With a mill pick, which is a small hammer with 2 hardened cutting edges. That work is called dressing the burrs. A 4-foot pair of French burr stones took a good hand 2 days to dress. It had to be done every 2 or 3 weeks in a working mill. It could not be done by machine in that country in that year. There was nothing to do it with but a hand and an eye and a pick, and a straight iron staff rubbed with red keel to show you the high places. And every time the pick struck the stone, it threw off splinters of steel finer than a hair, and they went into the backs and the sides of the miller's hands, and they stayed there, under the skin, and turned black, and did not come out. That is what those black flecks were. In the trade, when a man claimed to be a miller and there was doubt about it, he was asked to show his metal, and he turned his hands over, and there it was, or there it was not. It could not be faked, and it could not be bought, and it could not be got in a hurry, because it took years to put a good showing of it into a hand. Melinda Prine had been showing her metal since she was 19. Her father died on the 22nd of March, 1879. The mill on Skillet Fork had a mortgage on it that had been renewed twice in the bad years, and there was no way in the world to carry it, and the mortgage house took the mill and the water rights and the house and the 12 acres, and there was, at the end of everything, $409 for her out of the sale of the stock and the wagon and the household plunder. Out of the whole of that mill, she was allowed to keep exactly 2 things, and the reason she was allowed to keep them is that the appraiser looked at them and could not think what they were worth and put them down at $40 for the lot. The first was her father's chest of tools. 12 mill picks in a fitted rack, a proof staff 4 feet long, a paint staff, a bell rind, a set of hand hammers, a brace and a set of bits, a level, calipers, a marking gauge, and a straight edge her grandfather had made in Ohio in 1830. The second was a pair of French Bure millstones, 4 feet across, bedstone and runner, built up out of blocks of quartz from the quarries at La Ferté in France, hooped in iron, backed with plaster of Paris, and balanced, that Absalom Prine had bought in St. Louis in 1876 with the last free money he ever had, and had built up and balanced himself over 2 winters, and it never hung. He had never hung them because the water on Skillet Fork had gone off with the timber, and he had known, without ever once saying it out loud in his own house, that he was running out the string on a mill that was finished. He had them crated. He crated them himself in the winter of '78 in 2 flat oak boxes bolted at the corners, and he wrote on the inside of the lid of the top one, in carpenter's pencil, where nobody would see it until the box was opened, 1 line. The line said, "These ARE good stones, A&D somebody, will be glad of them." Melinda Prine paid the freight on them from Fairfield, Illinois to Hesper, Nebraska, 1,040 miles, and it cost her $68.10. which was more than a sixth of everything she had in the world, and she paid it in July of 1870, 4 weeks before Lyman Teal's last letter. And she paid it, because in the third letter she had told him what she was and how much of her there was, and he had written back that he had no objection to a woman with some size to her, and she had believed him. That is the part that nobody in Hesper knew for 2 years, and that is the part that makes the platform worse. She did not come out west and then get an idea. She came out west with a pair of millstones already crated in a boxcar, because she had told a man the truth about her body in writing, and he had told her it did not signify, and on the strength of that she had shipped everything she had 1,100 miles to a town she had never seen, to marry a miller and be a miller's wife in a mill. And then he took his hand down. She slept that first night on a cot in the back room of Hetty Dowd's eating house with the noise of a section engine working in the yard, and at 5 o'clock in the morning on the 12th of September, 1879, she got up and put on her boots and walked out of Hesper southbound down the wagon road alone, and she walked 5.5 miles. And she got to the Sherrill Mill on Turkey Creek at 7. And she stayed there all day, and she did not come back until after dark. The Sherrill Mill was better than it looked, and it looked like the end of the world. It stood on the east bank of Turkey Creek, where the creek came around a limestone shoulder and made a bend, and it was a frame, building 32 feet by 44, 2 floors and a loft, sitting on a foundation of dressed limestone laid dry and laid well, and the roof was hipped and had lost about a third of its shingles on the northwest slope. The windows were out. There were swallows in the loft in numbers that a person had to see. The whole ground floor had 6 inches of drifted silt in it from the flood of '77, and the silt had dried and cracked and grown a crop of pigweed that had come up through the floorboards where they had rotted. The head race was caved in for about 40 feet of its length. The dam was gone entirely except for the 2 stone abutments, and the pond bed above it was a flat of coarse sand with willow and 1 young cottonwood growing out of the middle of it that was 11 feet high, which is how she read 3 years without asking anybody. Josiah Sherrill had built the thing in 1872 with more hope than water sense. He had put in a high, tight dam of log crib and earth straight across, square to the current, and it had held for 5 years. And in the June rise of '77, the creek had come down out of the sandhills with a wall of water and half a section of driftwood in it, and had taken the middle out of that dam in about 90 seconds, and then taken the head race with it. And Sherrill, who had been hopper poor since the grasshopper years, had stood on the bank and looked at it, and then had gone into the house and told his wife to start packing. What Sherrill left, and what nobody in that county had the first idea was in the wheel pit. Melinda Prane got down into the wheel pit on the 12th of September, 1879. In the second hour she was on the place, by hanging on the sill and dropping, which for a woman of her weight is a thing you do once and think about afterward. There were 2 feet of stagnant water in it, and she went into it to her knees and put her hands down into it and felt around. And what her hands found was a cast-iron case about 3 feet across, bolted to a stone bedplate, with a vertical shaft coming up out of the top of it. It was a turbine, not an overshot wheel of wood, which is what everybody in Hesper assumed was down in that hole, and which after 3 years under water would have been so much soft brown pulp. It was one of the iron reaction wheels that had come into the trade after the war, a scroll case with fixed guides and a runner inside of it. And iron does not rot. The gates were seized, and the draft tube below it was full of sand, and the whole thing was covered in a rust like scale on a fish, and the wooden penstock that had fed it was gone, and the shaft was frozen solid in its step. But it was there, and it was iron, and it was worth, new out of a foundry in Ohio and freighted west, something better than $500. She sat on the edge of that pit for a while with her boots in the water. Then she went up into the mill and spent 4 hours going over the rest of it and writing in a little book with a pencil, and what she wrote is in the county museum at Renshaw, and it is a good deal more interesting than most things people write. She wrote that the sills were sound on 3 sides and gone on the creek side for 11 feet. She wrote that the main upright shaft was in place and true. She wrote that the great spur wheel had lost 9 cogs, but that the wooden cogs in a spur wheel are meant to be replaced and are made of apple or of hornbeam and are driven in like teeth in a comb, and that she could make cogs. She wrote that the bolting chest was ruined by damp and the silks rotted through, and she wrote a price for new silks. She wrote that the smutter was there and was worth saving. And she wrote, on the last page of that day, stones no good. Bedstone cracked through the eye. Runner burnt. Sherrill stones were a pair of common blue limestone burrs out of Kansas, which will do for corn and will never do for wheat, and one of them had been run dry at some point, which glazes and burns the face of a stone and takes the cut out of it, and the other one had a crack across the eye that you could put a knife blade in. Everybody in Hesper knew the Sherrill stones were cracked. It was one of the standing facts of the neighborhood. It was the reason nobody had ever bought the place. There is no mill without stones, and a pair of stones freighted out from St. Louis, built up and hooped and balanced, cost between $300 and $400 laid down at the depot, and there was not a farmer in that country in 1879 who had $400 in cash for anything at all. Melinda Prain had a pair of 4-foot French buers sitting in the freight room at the Hesper depot. She walked back into town in the dark and got in at 9:30 and ate everything Hetty Dowd put in front of her without saying one word, and then she said, "Who is the assignee?" Hetty Dowd said, "The what?" She said, "The mortgage house has got an agent that handles their dead paper in this state. There is always one. Who is he, and where does he sit?" He was a lawyer at Renshaw named Merrill Spavin, and on the 15th of September, 1879, Melinda Prain paid $2 and rode the 31 miles to Renshaw in the mail hack, sitting in the back with the sacks, and walked into that office, and came out an hour and 10 minutes later and rode back, and on the 29th of September, the deed was recorded. She paid $190 for the mill building, the machinery in it, the wheel pit, the dam site with both abutments, the head race, the water right, and 41 acres of creek bottom and broken ground that would not grow wheat and would grow willow, cottonwood, and hackberry, and that was the second most valuable thing on the place, and she knew it in the first hour. Because a mill runs on timber. Every cog, every flume board, every gate, every wedge, every trestle is timber, and a treeless country is a country where a mill dies of 1,000 small wants. She had $409 when her father died. The freight on the stones was $68.10. The land and mill was $190. The recording and the abstract was $6.50. Her fare from Illinois was $22 and change, and she had eaten on the way. When she walked back into Hetty Dowd's eating house on the evening of the 29th of September, 1879, with a deed folded in her apron bib, Melinda Prain had $91.80 in the world. No house, no horse, no wagon, no stove, and a mill 5.5 miles out of town with no dam, no race, no roof on the northwest slope, and 11 feet of rotten sill. Hetty Dowd looked at her over the top of the wire spectacles and said, "Well," and Melinda Prain said, "I will want a place to sleep out there before the weather turns, and I have got no team and no money to hire one. So I am going to be at you for a month about a cot and a stove, and I would rather ask you once than 16 times." Hetty Dowd said, "You will have the cot when you can get it hauled, and you will have my husband's cook stove that is standing in that shed rusting. And you will not thank me for either one of them, because the cot is a rope cot and it will not hold you, and you will have to build yourself a bed." She was right. Melinda Prain built herself a bed out of 2x6 oak in the northeast corner of the mill's second floor, 6 feet by 4 feet, and it took her a day and a half, and she slept on it for the next 2 years. Now the town. It has to be said that Hesper did not set out to be cruel to her. Hesper set out to be entertained by her, which in a place with one street and no theater is not the same thing and is sometimes worse. The first 3 weeks were the funny part. The story went around that the fat woman Lyman Teal had refused had bought the Sherrill Mill, and it was reckoned in both saloons that this was the finest thing that had happened in that county since the hoppers. And there was a good deal of speculation about what she meant to grind and who she meant to grind it for, and Purdy Lovelace got a run of 2 weeks out of a routine at the Antelope Bar in which he was a farmer bringing his wheat down to the lady's mill and being obliged to wait while she ate it. The second 3 weeks were not funny, because she did not do any of the things a person is supposed to do. She did not come into town and cry. She did not go around to the churchwomen. She did not go to Lyman Teal for anything, and she did not go past his mill, ever. Not once in 2 years. And she took the long way around by the school section to avoid it. And that got noticed. She did not talk about him at all. When somebody baited her about him, which happened perhaps 11 times in the first month, she looked at whoever said it with an expression of mild patience, the way a person looks at a dog barking on a chain, and answered a different question entirely. What she did do was work, 6 miles out of town where nobody could see it, and come in every 8 or 9 days for flour and coffee and nails. And the reports that trickled back into the store were, for a while, funny in a different way. Almon Wick the blacksmith, who had gone down there in the last week of September to look at the turbine, because he could not stand not knowing, came back and said that she had that wheel out of the pit. Nobody believed him. He said it again in the store on the 4th of October, with 4 men listening, and he said, "I am telling you that iron scroll case is up out of that hole and setting on skids on the bank, and there is not a horse on that place." And a man named Dietz said, "How?" And Almon Wick said, "She built a triangle out of 3 sticks, and she hung a set of blocks in it, and she done it with her hands over 4 days, a foot at a time, and when I come on her, she had a bar under it, and she was setting on the end of the bar, and she said good morning to me and asked me what a new set of gate rods would cost." The store went quiet for a second, and then somebody made a joke about the weight on the end of the bar, and the moment went by. But Almon Wick did not laugh at it, and Almon Wick was a man whose opinion in that town had some carry, because a blacksmith sees everybody and owes nothing to anybody but the man who sells him coal. October and November went into the building. She got the roof shingled with shakes she rived herself out of a cottonwood, which is a poor shingle and lasts 4 years and costs nothing. She got glass into 2 windows and boarded the rest. She tore out the rotten sills on the creek side, 11 feet of them, by jacking the corner up on stone and oak blocking a ½ inch at a time over 9 days, and put in new sills of bur oak that she cut out of her own 41 acres and squared with a broad axe, and there is a photograph of that oak sill still in place in 1928. She had, by the end of November, 3 tools she had not had in September, and she got them the way she got everything for 2 years, which was by trade. She got a crosscut saw and a set of wedges from Almon Wick in exchange for repairing the wooden pattern on his bellows and making him a new tire block. She got the loan of a team, 3 days a month, from a Bohemian farmer on the West Bank named František Sedlacek, whose family had been on that creek 4 years and who spoke about 90 words of English. And she got it because in the last week of October she walked up to his place in the rain and looked at his sweep and his stone boat and his corn crib, and then sat down on a nail keg and drew him a picture in the dirt of a corn sheller geared off his horsepower, and built it for him in 2 days out of his own scrap, and it shelled 40 bushels an hour, and he had 4 sons, and it saved that family 6 weeks of winter evenings every year for 11 years. František Sedlacek's opinion of Melinda Prine was formed on the 2nd of November, 1879, and it never afterward moved a hair, and neither did his wife's, whose name was Barbara, and who is the second most important woman in this story. And she got Roscoe Kim. Roscoe Kim was 19 years old in 1879, and he lived with an uncle on a claim 2 miles east of the mill, and he had gone deaf at 4 years old from scarlet fever and had never been to a school of any kind, and Hesper had decided about him when he was 6 and had never revisited it. The word used in that county was simple. He was reckoned to be a good boy and simple. And he was given the work that is given to a boy people think is simple, which is hauling water and turning a grindstone. And he was fed, and he was not paid, and nobody was unkind to him, and nobody ever once in his life had told him anything. He came down to the mill in October, because there was noise there, and there had been no noise on that creek in 3 years. And he stood at the corner of the building for 2 days watching, and on the 3rd day Melinda Prine was trying to lift the end of an 18-foot oak stick and could not get it up on the skid alone. And she looked around, and he was there, and she pointed at the far end of the stick. He picked it up. She found out he was deaf inside of about 4 minutes, and it made no difference to her at all. And this is the thing about Melinda Prine that a person has to understand to make sense of everything that comes later. She had spent her whole life in a building where nobody could hear anything. A working mill is a roar, stones running, gearing running, the shoe rattling on the damsel, the elevators, the bolter, the water. Nobody in a mill talks. Millers do everything by sign and by touch, and every mill family in America had its own set of signs, and Absalom Prine's family had a full one, 40 or 50 signs deep. For stop, for slow her, for the bolt is choking, for come here, for water, for how much, for good. And Melinda Prine had used those signs from the time she was 4 years old and could have used them in her sleep. So she pointed, and he came, and she showed him, and within 11 days she had taught him 9 signs, and within a month she was talking to Roscoe Kim at a rate of about 40 words a minute, and he was answering, and he was the first person in his life to be talked to. He moved into the mill loft the 2nd week of December, 1879, with his uncle's blessing and his uncle's spare quilt, and he stayed 43 years. Now, about the winter of 79 and 80, there is not much drama and there is a great deal of work, and this is where the story would have died if she had been anybody else. She had no money. She had $91 at the end of September, and by New Year's she had $31. She could not buy lumber, and she could not hire labor, and she could not have the turbine gates recast, and she was 5.5 miles from a town that thought she was a joke. And she had made a decision in the wheel pit in September that half the men in that county would not have made, and that is the decision that this whole story turns on. Osiah Sherrill's dam had been high and tight and square across the creek. It had made a beautiful pond and a fall of 11 feet, and it had been swept away by the first real water that came down. Melinda Prine, standing in the pond bed on the 12th of September, looking at the sand in the willow, had read out of that sand exactly what Turkey Creek was. It was not an Illinois creek. It had a watershed of 40-some miles of sandhill and short grass tableland with nothing on it to hold rain, and it ran a foot deep most of the year, and it came down 11 feet in 6 hours, twice a decade, with half a county of driftwood in it, and any dam that stood square in front of that and tried to argue was going to lose. So she did not build a dam 11 feet high. She built one 4.5 feet high, and she built it long, and she built it curved, and she gave it an apron. The whole design is in her book. A low crib of oak logs, notched and pinned, filled with rock, hauled out of the limestone shoulder above the bend, faced on the upstream side with plank, and on the downstream side, an apron of plank and rock running out 22 feet at a shallow slope so that the water going over the crest never fell onto the creek bed and never dug a hole under her own toe. And in the north end of it, a spillway 16 feet wide with the crest laid a foot lower than the rest, so that in a rise the creek had somewhere to go that was not through the middle of her dam. 4.5 feet of head is not much. With a fall of 4.5 feet and the water Turkey Creek carried at a normal stage, that turbine would give her something between 9 and 11 horsepower. And 11 horsepower will turn one 4-foot run of stone and an elevator and a bolter and nothing else, and it will grind, in wheat, about 6 bushels an hour. Lyman Teal's steam mill had a 50-horsepower engine, 3 run of stone, a full set of bolting reels and purifiers, and it would grind 40 barrels a day. She knew all of that in September. She wrote the comparison out in her own book in November, in 2 columns, honestly, with his side of it larger in every line but 2. The 2 lines where her column was larger were these: fuel, his column said, coal from the cars. Hers said, the creek. Toll, his column said, 1/5. Hers said, 1/10, and I will not move it. She cut and hauled the crib logs out of her own timber all through December and January with Sedlacek's team 3 days a month, and with Roscoe Kim and a chain and a stone boat the rest of the time. She quarried rock off the shoulder with a bar and wedges and rolled it down. She cut and hewed and pinned. In February, the creek went to the bottom with ice, and she took the 6 weeks of it and got down into the wheel pit with a chisel and a wire brush and a can of coal oil and freed the turbine gates, one at a time, over 19 days, lying on her side in a stone hole in February in Nebraska with her arms in past the elbows. Roscoe Kim heated bricks in the cook stove and packed them in around her legs and changed them out every hour. And in the last week of March, 1880, when the creek came up with a thaw, Melinda Prine and Roscoe Kim and František Sedlacek and his 4 sons and Barbara Sedlacek and a German neighbor named Otto Hanselmann closed the last gap in that dam with rock and sacked sand in a day and a half, working in water to their waists, and the pond came up behind it that night. And on the morning of the 1st of April, 1880, there was 500 feet of still bright water above the Sherrill Mill for the first time since June of '77. That was the day the town found out she was serious. Because water in a country like that shows. You can see a new pond from 3 miles off. And by the 4th of April, there had been 11 separate parties of men out from Hesper to stand on the bank and look at it, and the tone in the store changed inside of 1 week. From what is she doing out there to what is she going to grind it with, and that is where the town's attention landed and stuck, because everybody knew the answer. There was nothing to grind it with. The Sherrill stones were cracked and burnt. And 2 crates were sitting in the freight room at the Hesper depot, and had been sitting there since the 11th of September, and Farrell Judd, the station agent, had taken her storage money by the week in advance, every week, for 6 months, and had never once been told what was in them, and had never once asked. A pair of 4-foot French Buer millstones, bedstone and runner, crated in oak, weighs about 2,600 pounds. That is not a great weight for a wagon. It is a large weight for 1 wagon load over 5.5 miles of prairie road with 2 creek crossings and a pitch down into the Turkey Creek bottom that drops 60 feet in a quarter mile. And it is a weight that will not forgive one wrong thing. A crated millstone that gets loose on a downgrade will go through the tailgate, through the team, and into the ditch, and the stone will crack, and a cracked stone is a rock. She went into Hesper on the 6th of April, 1880, and asked 4 men to haul them. The first was the livery. The liveryman said his heavy wagon was spoken for, and did not say by whom, and looked at the floor while he said it. The second was a farmer named Dietz with a good running gear, who said he would want $6, and she said she would give him $6, and he came out of it 2 days later with a story about a lame horse. The third was the drayman in town, who did all the depot hauling, and who was, as everybody including Melinda Prine already knew, under contract to Lyman Teal for the mill's coal and flour, and could not have taken that job if his life had turned on it. And who said so, straight out, to her face, which she appreciated, and told her that if she got them out to the Turkey Creek Bridge he would come down after dark and help her get them off, for nothing, and never tell anybody, and he did not have to do that. The fourth was Ivar Dahl. Ivar Dahl freighted. He had come out of Norway at 11, and out of Minnesota at 28, and he had 4 big mules, and a heavy Studebaker wagon, and a tent, and a picket rope, and he hauled anything anywhere for a price, and was gone from the county for 3 weeks at a time, running lumber up from the railhead and buffalo bones down to it, and machinery out to the sandhill ranches. And he owed no man in Hesper anything, and he did not drink, and he did not go to church, and he was 35 years old and not married, and nobody had ever much wondered why, because Ivar Dahl had a stammer. It was not a small one. It was the kind that stops a man dead in the middle of his own name and holds him there with his mouth open and the whole room watching. And it had been beaten at him by a schoolmaster in Minnesota and prayed over by 2 ministers and laughed at by every crew he had ever worked in. And by 35, he had solved it the way such men solve it, which is by not talking. He gave prices by holding up fingers. He said "ja," and he said "no," and he said a name if he could get at it. And beyond that, he wrote on a slate he carried in the wagon box in a good clear hand, because he had schooling and could figure to 3 decimals. She found him at the wagon yard on the 7th of April greasing a hub, and she stood there until he looked up, and she said, "I have got 2 crates in the freight room, 4 foot by 4 foot by 18 inches, 2,600 pounds for the pair. They are millstones. I want them at my mill on Turkey Creek without one corner touching anything, and I have got $11, and I will tell you now that is every cent I have, and I am not holding back a reserve." Ivar Dahl looked at her for a long moment. Then he wiped his hands and got the slate out of the wagon box and wrote on it and turned it around. It said, "What is the pitch into the bottom?" And she said, 1 6 for about a quarter mile, on a bench road with a soft outside edge and a bad place 40 yards from the bottom where the water has cut in under it. He wrote, "I will want a chain on behind A&D, 1 man on the drag." She said, "I have got a man." He wrote, $8. She said, "It is 11 or nothing. Do not do that to me. I know what the haul is worth, and I will not carry a favor around for 3 years. Ivar Dahl looked at her again, and something went across his face that she did not read at the time and thought about a good deal later, and he rubbed the slate out with his sleeve and wrote 1 word and held it up. The word was, "Ja." They loaded on the morning of the 9th of April with the depot crew and a set of skids and a plank ramp, bedstone first, laid flat on a bed of straw with the crate lashed to the standards on both sides and blocked fore and aft, and then the runner on top of it with more straw between, and they were 3 hours doing what most men would have done in 40 minutes. Farrell Judd said afterward that neither one of them said above 11 words the whole morning, and that it was the most orderly piece of work he ever watched. The team went out of Hesper at 9:30 on the 9th of April, 1880, 4 mules and a heavy wagon walking, with a Norwegian freighter on the near side at their heads, and a deaf young man on the drag chain, and a woman of 327 pounds walking behind the tailgate the entire 5.5 miles with her hand on the crate. And a good part of the town came out to the end of the street to see it go. They took the pitch into the bottom at a crawl, with the wheels chained, and Roscoe Kim hanging on the rear chain, and the whole load easing down 1 wheel turn at a time, and Ivar Dahl walked backward the whole way down that grade, watching the outside rear wheel, and never once looked at anything else. At the bad place 40 yards from the bottom the outside edge went. It went the way a cut bank goes, without any warning at all, about 3 feet of it dropping out from under the rear wheel, and the wagon lurched and sat down hard on the low side, and the top crate came off its blocking and started. What happened next took perhaps 4 seconds, and there were 3 people there, and they told it the same way for the rest of their lives. Ivar Dahl got the mules stopped without turning them. Roscoe Kim, who could not hear the shout and did not need it, threw his weight onto the drag and held. And Melinda Prine, who was walking behind the tailgate with her hand on the crate, put her shoulder into the low corner of a 1,300-pound crated millstone that was going over and stopped it and held it, standing in the road with her boots plowing, for as long as it took Ivar Dahl to get a chain around the standard and take a turn. She was 14 seconds under it, by his count, and he was counting. When it was chained, and the wagon was jacked, and the wheel was back on hard ground, and they were sitting on the bank, Ivor Dahl got out the slate. He wrote, "Nobody could have done that." And Melinda Prine looked at the slate and said, in the driest voice in Nebraska, "Mr. Dahl, there is exactly one thing in this world I have got more of than anybody else in this county, and it has been thrown in my face on a train platform in front of 90 people, and today it was useful, and I would be obliged if we could get on down this hill." He put the slate away, but he kept the sentence. He told it to two men in Renshaw in 1884, and he told it to a newspaper man in 1912, and it is in the county history in his words, and it is the first time in this story that anybody said out loud what her weight actually was to her, which was neither a shame nor a joke, but a tool, in a trade made entirely out of weight. In a building where every single thing that mattered was heavy. The stones came off the wagon at the mill at 20 minutes to 2 in the afternoon of the 9th of April, 1880. She paid Ivor Dahl $11. He took it, because she had told him not to do that to her, and he had heard her. Then she was broke, and she had a mill with a dam and a turbine and a pair of the best millstones between St. Louis and Denver lying flat in the yard in 2 oak boxes, and she had no money to hang them with. Hanging a pair of stones is not simply setting them down. The bedstone lies fixed, dead level, on a heavy timber frame called the husk. The runner lies over it, face to face, riding on an iron spindle that comes up through the eye of the bedstone, and the runner is carried on a crosspiece called the rind that is let into its underside, and the whole weight of that runner, 1,300 pounds, is balanced on the top of that spindle on a bearing the size of a walnut. Under the floor, the foot of that spindle sits in a step, and the step sits on a beam called the bridge tree, and one end of the bridge tree is on a hinge, and the other end sits on a screw. And by turning that screw a quarter turn, you raise or lower the entire runner stone by a few thousandths of an inch. And that adjustment, called tentering, is the difference between good flour and no flour. All of it has to be true. The bedstone has to be level in every direction, the spindle has to be exactly plumb, and exactly in the middle of the eye. The runner has to be balanced so that it does not lift on one side at speed, and the two faces have to be parallel within about the thickness of a sheet of paper across 4 feet. It took her from the 10th of April to the 22nd of May, and it cost her, in money she did not have, $11.40 for ironwork at Almanwick's forge, which she paid for in April by making Almanwick a set of 6 new wooden cog patterns, and in May by doing his books, which had not been done since 1878, and which took her 4 evenings and turned up $109 in uncollected accounts that he had entirely forgotten about, so that in the end he owed her money and paid it in iron and never quite got over it. She set the husk frame on new oak posts down to the stone foundation. She leveled the bedstone with a straight edge and a level and lead shims, and took 2 days doing it. She trammed the spindle plumb with a jack staff and a piece of quill, and turned the screw, and tapped the step, and turned it again, over and over, for a day and a half, until a quill fixed to the spindle passed the same distance from the bedstone eye all the way around. She balanced the runner with a bell wren, and lead poured into the balancing holes. And she found it 3/4 of an ounce heavy on one side, and would not accept it, and did it again. Roscoe Kim learned the whole of it standing beside her, and he could do the tram alone by June of the next year, and better than she could by 1885, because he had steadier hands. And then, in the last week of May, 1880, she opened the crates. The lid of the top one came off, and there, inside, in her father's carpenter pencil, was the line he had written in the winter of '78 in Illinois, when he knew what he was and knew he was finished, and had crated a pair of stones for a mill he was never going to build. These ARE good stones, A&D somebody will be glad of them. Roscoe Kim said afterward, in signs, that she sat down on the floor of the mill and stayed there a while, and that it was the only time in 43 years he saw her do it. Now the dressing. The stones had never been hung and never been run, and the faces on them were as Absalom Prine had left them in Illinois in 1876. And a stone that has sat crated for 4 years has to be gone over, and beyond that she had her own way of laying out a face, and she was not going to run a mill on anybody else's furrows, not even his. She dressed both stones in the first week of June, 1880, on the meal floor of the Sherrill Mill with the doors open, and the town came out and watched, and that is the week the county stopped laughing. She turned the runner over on its back with a crane and a pair of stone dogs and a set of blocks, and she cleaned the face with a wire brush. And she rubbed a straight iron staff with red keel and laid it across the face and rubbed it around, and it left red on every high place, and the whole face of that stone came up looking like a map of an island chain. And then she got down on her knees on it, with a leather pad under her knees and a rag around her wrist, and picked the red off, blow by blow, with a mill pick weighing 2.5 pounds, and did that for hours, and staffed it again, and picked it again, and staffed it again, until the staff came off clean. That is the facing. That is the part that just makes the stone true. The dress comes after. She laid out 10 harps on that stone, which is the quarter dress that came out of the French mills. 10 sets of furrows radiating from the eye like the vanes on a fan, each harp with a master furrow and 3 journeymen behind it, all of them struck on a draft, so that the leading edge of every furrow was a shearing edge, and cut down deep at the eye and running out to nothing at the skirt, so that the meal was carried outward and cut smaller and smaller as it went. Then, on the flat lands between the furrows, she cracked the face. 16 cracks to the inch, struck with the fine edge of the pick, parallel, shallow, the whole surface of a 4-foot stone covered in them, every one of them laid by hand and eye, hour after hour after hour. Kneeling, the bedstone was the same, cut in the mirror, so that when the runner turned above it, the 2 sets of edges crossed each other like the blades of a shears, and everything between them was cut, and nothing was crushed. It took her 9 days for the pair. By the 3rd day there were 15 people out on that bank. By the 6th there were 40. On Sunday, the 6th of June, 1880, there were something better than 100 in their church clothes, standing in the mill yard and sitting on the wagons and up in the door, and Barbara Sedlacek and 2 German women had set up trestles and were selling coffee and kolaches and doing well at it, and Hetty Dowd had shut the eating house and come out in the mail hack. They came because there is nothing in this world so watchable as somebody doing hard-skilled work with their hands, and because not one soul in that county had ever seen it done. And on the 4th day of it, Enos Baumgartner came. Enos Baumgartner was 75 years old and lived with his son on a place north of Kelso Ridge, and had come out of Lancaster County, Pennsylvania in 1868, and had been, for 31 years before that, the head miller at a merchant mill on the Conestoga with 3 run of stone, and had never told anybody in Nebraska about it because nobody had ever asked him anything. He came in his son's wagon, and he got down, and he walked in through the crowd with a black hat in his hands, and he stood over her for about 10 minutes and did not say a word. Then he got down on his knees on the meal floor, which at 75 took him a while and 2 hands, and he leaned over the face of that bedstone, and he put his fingers flat on it and drew them across the lands. And then he set his cheek very nearly down on the stone and sighted along it toward the light in the door. And Enos Baumgartner said, in front of 100 and some people, in the accent of a man who had spoken German at home for 75 years, 10 quarters. Draft is right. Cracks is 16, and they are even to the skirt. Girl, who learned you this? And Melinda Prine, on her knees, with a pick in her hand, said, Absalom Prine, on Skillet Fork in Illinois. He was my father. The old man got up off the floor with help from 2 men and put his hat on and stood there and looked out over that crowd of farmers, and he said, to all of them and to none of them, I have been 11 years in this state, and I have not seen a stone dressed. Not one. Teal has got a man comes out from Omaha twice a year and charges him $40 and does not know a master furrow from a wagon rut, and that is why your flour is gray, and that is why your bread does not rise like your mother's, and you have all been standing here calling this woman a name I have heard in my own son's kitchen. And I am telling you that there is not a mill in 300 miles of here that has got what is laying on this floor, and I am too old to say it twice. Then he asked her for a pick, and she gave him one, and he knelt back down and cracked about 4 inches of one land, badly, with his hands shaking, and laughed at himself and gave it back. And then he turned his hands over, palm up, in the light of the door, and showed the black flecks of steel that had been in the skin of them since before the Mexican War, and he said, "That is metal. That is a miller's hands. Now show them yours." Melinda Prane stood up off her knees, in front of 100 and some people, and turned her hands over. The palms and the backs of them, from the knuckles to the wrist, were shot through with fine black flecks, like pepper under the skin, thousands of them, in a scatter so dense across the back of the right hand that from 6 feet away it looked like a bruise that would not come out. Nobody said anything for a moment. And then a farmer named Willis Fenstermaker, who had 400 acres and a family of 9, and who had hauled his wheat to Lyman Teal's mill and paid 1/5 of it for 6 years, said, out loud in the mill yard, "Ma'am, when do you open?" He said, "When the wheat comes off." And Willis Fenstermaker said, "I have got 400 acres of red fife going to be ready the 2nd week of July, and I will bring you the first load of it, and I will bring it if I have to haul it past his door." The Turkey Creek Mill started on the morning of the 28th of June, 1880, with nobody there but Melinda Prine, Roscoe Kim, and Barbara Sedlacek, who had walked down with a sack of last year's corn on her hip because she said somebody ought to be there, and it might as well be somebody who could cook. She opened the head gate at 10 minutes past 6. The water came down the new race, which was plank on oak stringers, and had taken her 3 weeks, and went into the penstock and into the scroll case, and she stood in the wheel pit hatch with her hand on the gate rod and let it into that turbine 1/4 of an inch at a time. And the iron shaft that had been frozen in its step since June of 1877 turned over. Then it ran. She let it up to speed and stood on the meal floor with her hand flat on the husk frame for about a minute and a half with her eyes shut, and Roscoe Kim stood with his palm flat on the floorboards, and neither of them looked at the stone at all, because you do not run a mill by looking. This is the whole of Melinda Prine's method, and it is the reason she is remembered, and it has nothing to do with strength and nothing to do with size, and it is the exact opposite of everything that was said about her on that platform. A stone running true has one sound. A stone running out of tram has another. A stone running too close has a hot smell and a thin whine to it, and a stone running too far apart chatters and passes the wheat through whole and makes nothing but bran and money for nobody. A stone running empty, with no grain between the faces, makes a bright ringing note and throws sparks and will burn a wooden mill to the ground in 11 minutes. And every miller who ever lived has one nightmare, and that is it. And the meal itself talks the loudest. You take a handful of it out of the spout at the eye of the stone, and you close your fist on it and open it. And if it stays in a cake in your palm, it is right. And if it falls apart, it is too dry, and you are grinding to no purpose. And if it packs like wet clay, you are grinding too close and cooking the middlings, and your flour will be dark, and it will not keep. And you rub it between finger and thumb, and you feel the grit of the semolina against the softness of the flour, and you know, in a second and a half, exactly where to put the tentering screw. Absalom Prine had taught his daughter that with her eyes shut, on purpose, sitting on a nail keg at Skillet Fork, from the time she was 7, because his own father had taught him the same way, and because a miller who has to look at his meal is going to be a poor miller in a dark corner in a hurry. So she had the best hands in 300 miles, and she had taught the whole of it to a deaf young man who could not hear the stone, but who could feel the floor. and between the two of them they had every sense that mill needed. She ground 11 bushels of corn that first day and gave Barbara Sedlacek every grain of the meal back and would not take toll on it. And Barbara Sedlacek took it home and baked with it. And by the end of that week there were 4 Bohemian and 2 German families on the west bank of Turkey Creek who had eaten out of that mill and who had told everybody they knew. The wheat came on the 12th of July. Willis Fenstermaker brought the first load, as he had said he would, 41 bushels of red fife in a wagon box with a canvas over it. And he hauled it 11 miles, and he hauled it past Lyman Teal's mill door with the load uncovered so that everybody in Hesper would see what was in it and where it was going, which was, in that county in that year, the equivalent of standing up in church. Melinda Prine met him in the mill yard with a wooden scoop in her hand. She told him the terms before he unloaded, standing at his wheel, and she told them to every man who ever came into that yard for 43 years, in the same words, and Roscoe Kim had them lettered on a board and hung by the door in 1882, and they hung there until the mill closed. The board said, toll 1/10. Cash price for merchant work. No grist ground out of turn for any man. No smutty wheat, and no musty wheat, and I will show you why. That last line got her more custom than the first one. Because the great secret of the milling business in that country in that decade was that a farmer had no way on earth of knowing whether he had been cheated, and every farmer in America knew that he had no way of knowing. And the suspicion of it sat in the back of every wagon that ever came down a mill lane. He brought wheat, and he went away with flour, and there was nothing in between but somebody else's building. Melinda Prine's answer to that was so simple that it took Lyman Teal 2 years to understand what it had done to him. She let them in. Anybody who brought a grist could come up onto the meal floor and stand and watch the whole of it, and she would stop what she was doing and show them. And she showed everybody the same things in the same order. Here is your wheat going into the hopper. Here is the smutter that takes the dirt and the smut balls off of it before it ever sees a stone. Here is where it goes between the stones. Put your hand under this spout and feel that. That is your own wheat. Squeeze it. Feel how it cakes. That means the stones are set right and I am not burning your flour. And here's the bolting reel, and here is your flour, and here's your bran and your shorts, and that pile there is my 10th, and you may look at it as long as you like. Nobody had ever done that to them. By the end of July, she was grinding 6 days a week from daylight until she could not see, and by the middle of August there were wagons waiting in that yard at 4 in the morning, and she was grinding about 50 bushels a day, which is nothing at all next to a 40-barrel steam mill, and which was every single bushel that a 4-foot run of stone and 11 horsepower of Turkey Creek could put through. And there was a line. And in the 3rd week of August, 1880, Lyman Teal dropped his toll to 1/8. He did it quietly, by a notice on his own door, and everybody in that county understood it inside of 1 day, and the understanding did him more harm than the toll had. Because a man who has taken 1/5 for 6 years, and who drops to 1/8 in the month after a woman 5 miles out of town opens a burr mill on a creek, has just published, on his own door, in his own hand, that 1/5 was never necessary. Willis Fenstermaker set it in the store on the 24th of August, and it went round that county like a grass fire. He said, "Boys, he has just handed us the bill for 1875. And 1876, and 1877, and 1878, and 1879. Now it would be an easy thing, and a false one, to make Lyman Teal into a villain out of a melodrama for the rest of this, and the county history is careful about it, and so will this telling be. Because what he actually did over the next 15 months was smaller and meaner and much more ordinary than villainy. And it is the kind of thing that men of property do everywhere, and always, and mostly, get away with. He did not burn her mill. He did not send anybody out there. There is no evidence he ever said one word against her in public in his life, and there are two witnesses that when Purdy Lovelace started up with the tombstone joke in the bank in September of 1880, Lyman Teal told him to shut his mouth and get out, and meant it. What he did was paper. In September, he had his lawyer at Renshaw write to the mortgage house in Chicago inquiring whether the water right conveyed with the Sherrill property was in fact appurtenant, and got an answer he did not like. In October, he bought, at a good price, a quarter section on Turkey Creek, a mile and a half above her dam, from a discouraged man named Hobbs who was going back to Ohio, and he bought it for one reason, which was the creek frontage, and everybody knew it. A man who owns land above a dam can sue a mill for backwater, for flooding his bottom, for damage to his hay ground, and can keep suing, and the mill has to answer every time. And a lawsuit at Renshaw cost $40 to defend even when you won. He never filed it. He held it over her for 15 months, and the reason he never filed it is that when he had his man go out and set stakes and take levels in the first week of November, 1880, the levels came back and showed that at full pond the water on the Hobbs bottom stood exactly 11 inches deep over about 2 acres of willow flat that had been standing water in the spring since before the county was organized. And that was all. Because she had built a 4.5-foot dam instead of an 11-foot one, and there was not a court in Nebraska that would give a man $1 for 11 inches of willow flat. He had bought a quarter section of poor bottom land for $400 in order to sue a woman, and had found out that she had made herself unsuable 18 months earlier in the pond bed in September, before she owned the place, with a decision that everybody in Hesper had said at the time was the mistake of an amateur who did not know that you build a dam as high as the ground will let you. That is the whole shape of it. Every single thing that saved her that year and the next was a thing she had done for a reason that was not about him. The other thing he did was the wheat. Lyman Teal bought wheat. He had the elevator at the Hesper siding under lease, and he was the only cash buyer between Kelso Ridge and the state line, and in September of 1880 he began, quietly, without any notice on any door, to grade a little harder and to pay a cent or two under the Renshaw price to men whose wagons had been seen going down the Turkey Creek Road. It was never provable. It was never said. It was done by a look and a shrug and a chalk mark on a slate, and it was perfectly effective on about a third of the farmers in that country, and they went back to his mill and were ashamed of themselves and were not particularly to blame, because a man with a note at the bank and 9 children does not get to be a hero on principle. Melinda Prine's answer to that was to say nothing about it whatsoever. She said it to Hetty Dowd in October, over a cup of coffee at the counter, and Hetty Dowd wrote it down that same night on the back of a bill, because she wanted to have it right. She said, "He can have them. I do not want a man's custom that he is paying for out of his wheat check. I want the ones that are left, and I want them to be able to say they never left, and in about 2 years I will want the others back, and if I have said one word about him in the meantime, I will not be able to have them, because a man will not come back to a mill where he has been talked about." Hetty Dowd said, "And if it is not 2 years? If it is 10? And Melinda Prine said, "Then it is 10. I am 25 years old, and I have got a mill, and the mill will be here." That autumn there were 2 more things. The first is that on the 11th of September, 1880, which was 1 year to the day from the platform, Melinda Prine ground 44 bushels of wheat and dressed the runner stone in the evening and went to bed, and did not mention the date to anybody, and there is no reason to think she noticed it, and Roscoe Kim, who did notice it, because he kept the day book, wrote in the margin of the day book 1 word in his large, careful hand, and the word was year. The second is Ivor Dahl. He hauled her flour that autumn, 6 loads, in and out of Hesper and up to the Sandhill ranches on his regular runs, and he charged her the going rate and she paid it, and neither of them made anything of it. He would come into the yard at dusk and unhitch and eat whatever was in the pot and sleep in the wagon and be gone at 4 in the morning. He talked to Roscoe Kim on the slate. He learned 9 of the mill signs by watching, and then 40 of them, and by the winter Ivor Dahl was having conversations in that mill that he had not been able to have anywhere on earth since he was 11 years old, because a language made for a building full of noise turns out to work just as well for a man whose mouth will not open on command. Barbara Sedlacek saw the whole of it about 8 months before either of them did, and told her husband so in Czech in December of 1880, and he said she was a fool, and she was not. Now the winter of 1880 and 1881 is the one that the people who lived through it in that part of the country did not compare to other winters, because they did not think it belonged in the same class of thing. There are men who wrote about the winter of 1886 and the blizzard of 1888, and who mention them the way you mention a bad storm. When those same men wrote about 1880 and 81, they wrote about it the way people write about a war. It began on the 15th of October. Nobody was ready, because nobody had ever needed to be ready in October. The corn was standing in the field, and about a third of it was not shucked. There was hay down. There were cattle on grass 11 miles from a shed, and a good many families had not yet hauled their winter coal from the depot, and half the county's wheat was still in the bin unhauled, because Teal was paying under the Renshaw price, and everybody was holding for a better market. It came out of the northwest at 3 in the afternoon on the 15th, with a wind that took the roof off the Hesper School, and it snowed for 2 days without stopping, and when it quit on the 17th, there were drifts 11 feet deep in the cuts on the branch line, and there was no more grass in that county for anything until the following April. That was the October storm. Then it snowed again on the 4th of November, and again on the 9th, and again on the 23rd, and it never once thawed enough to settle what was down, and by the 1st of December, when a normal Nebraska winter would just be getting up in the morning, that country had already had its whole winter's snow on the ground for 6 weeks, and had not seen the top of a fence post since the middle of October. The trains began to fail in November. A branch line in a snow country lives on its cuts, and once a cut fills with drift, it packs to something with the density of green wood, and a snowplow of that era was a wedge of oak and iron on the front of a locomotive that got its way by being run at the drift at 40 miles an hour, and there is a limit to that. And the limit is a cut that is full to the top for a quarter of a mile. The Burlington kept the branch open into Hesper, more or less, through November and December with shovel gangs and 2 engines. On the 4th of January, 1881, a train came in from the east at 9 in the evening with 14 cars, and it was the last one. There was not another train into Hesper, Nebraska for 125 days. The next train came in at 20 minutes past 2 in the afternoon on the 9th of May, 1881. And the whole town went to the depot to look at it, and about 40 people cried, including 2 men who were on the shovel gang, and it helped dig it in. What 125 days without a railroad meant in a town 4 years old on the end of a branch line in a treeless country is easy to write down and hard to feel, so here it is, written down. There was no coal. What coal there was in that county on the 4th of January was in the sheds and in the cellars, and it was gone by the middle of February, and after that people burnt corn, which they had, and hay twisted into hard sticks, which they had less of than they thought because of the October storm, and green cottonwood, and fence rails, and finally, in some houses, the boards of their own sheds. There was no kerosene after the first week of March. There was no sugar, no coffee that anybody would recognize, no salt in 3 townships after the 20th of March, and the salt was the thing that broke people's nerve more than anything else, because a family with no salt cannot cure, cannot keep, and cannot make food taste like food. And there is a particular kind of despair that comes off a table of unsalted boiled wheat in the 4th month. And there was no flour. Not because there was no wheat. There was wheat. There was a great deal of wheat in that county on the 4th of January, 1881, more than usual, because everybody had held their crop back through the fall, waiting for a better price out of a man who was paying under the market, and it was sitting in bins on 400 farms, dry and sound and good. A bin of wheat is not food. A bin of wheat is a promise that requires a machine. And on the 11th of February, 1881, at about 2 in the afternoon, the machine that 90% of that county depended on stopped. Lyman Teal's mill was a good mill, and he was not a fool about it, and he had 81 tons of Rock Springs coal in the shed at Hesper on the 4th of January, 1881, which in an ordinary winter would have carried him to the middle of May with a margin. It did not carry him to the middle of February, and the reason is arithmetic that nobody in that county had ever had to do before. His mill ran on a 50-horsepower engine, and an engine of that size and that vintage, running a full mill, burned something over a ton of coal a day. In an ordinary January, he ground 8 or 9 days that month, because in an ordinary January, the flour of that country came out of Minneapolis and Kansas City in sacks on the cars, and a local mill ground custom work for farmers and a little merchant flour and no more. In January of 1881, there were no cars. Every family within 20 miles of Hesper that had been eating store flour all its life came to Lyman Teal's mill in the second week of January with wheat in a sled box, and he ground for them, and he ground for them well. And he dropped his toll from 1/8 to 1/12 on the 14th of January and announced it at the church door, and it was a decent thing to do, and it should be said. And he ran that engine 20 hours a day for 4 weeks. He burned his 81 tons by the 5th of February. He had sent 2 men with 4 horses to Renshaw on the 21st of January to try to buy coal, and they got 22 miles in 3 days and came back. He burned corn after that, which will make steam and which fowls are great, and he burned baled hay, and he had 12 men shoveling snow off the frozen slough west of town to get at his water supply, because his well would not keep up with a boiler, and on the 9th of February the water haul failed for 2 days in a storm, and he had to bank his fires. And on the 11th of February, 1881, at about 2 in the afternoon, running on green cottonwood and corn with a boiler that had been worked past its sense for 5 weeks, Lyman Teal's mill cracked a flue sheet. There was no boiler shop nearer than Omaha. There was no way to get to Omaha. There was no way to get a flue sheet, or a man who could set one, into Hesper, Nebraska before May, and every soul standing in that mill yard understood the whole of it inside of about a minute. He shut the gate. He put a padlock on the door, because there was wheat in there belonging to 61 families, and he was responsible for it. And he walked up the street to his house with the bay window, and he did not come out of it for 4 days, and the county has never been quite sure whether that was shame or whether it was arithmetic, and it was probably both, because Lyman Teal had been doing the same arithmetic everybody else was doing. Which was this: there were in that district 982 people. There was flour in that county on the 11th of February to last them, by any honest reckoning, about 11 days. And there was 1 machine left inside of 31 miles that could turn wheat into bread. Melinda Prine had been running it night and day since the 9th of January. The ice is the part that nobody expects, and it is the reason there had never been a winter mill on Turkey Creek. And it is worth understanding what she was actually fighting, because it was not the cold, and it was not the snow, and it was not the town. It was ice, and ice in a stream does 3 separate things, and every one of them will stop a mill. The first thing is surface ice on the pond, which is the least of it, and which mostly helps, because a pond under a lid does not lose water to the wind. The second thing is anchor ice, which is the one that kills. In very cold, clear weather, on a shallow, fast stream, ice forms not on the surface but on the bottom, on gravel and on rock and on ironwork, in a spongy mass. And it builds, and it will feel a head race and pack a trash rack solid in one night and choke a turbine from below. And there is nothing to see from the bank at all. A mill on a prairie creek in a hard January can be sitting behind a full pond with a bone-dry wheel pit. And the third thing is Brazil, which is loose slush ice running with the current, and which comes down and mats against the rack in a matter of minutes. Absalom Prine had run a mill through 30 winters on Skillet Fork, and he had lost exactly 2 weeks to ice in the whole of it. And his daughter had grown up with the answers so thoroughly that she never once in her life thought of them as answers, and she started putting them in place in the last week of November, 1880. 6 weeks before the first person in Hesper had any idea that anything was going to matter. She covered the head race, all 240 feet of it, with plank and brush and straw and finally with snow, so that it ran in a tunnel and never saw the sky and never saw the wind, because anchor ice does not form on water that cannot radiate its heat to a clear sky. She built a floating boom of poles across the pond above the head gate to catch the Frazil coming down. She set the trash rack on a slope instead of upright, with a raking bar hung above it on a pin, so that one person could clear the whole face of it in about 40 seconds from inside the mill without going out into the weather. And, above all of it, she never let the water stop. That is the great rule, and it is why the mill on Turkey Creek ran that winter, and no other mill in 3 counties did. Moving water does not freeze in a covered channel. Standing water does. From the 9th of January, 1881 until the 12th of April, 1881, the head gate at the Turkey Creek Mill was never once closed, day or night, Sunday or storm, and when there was nothing to grind the water went through and turned the wheel and went out the tail race and did no work at all. And Melinda Prine led it, because the alternative was a race full of ice by morning and a mill shut for the season, which meant that the mill was never quiet, and that somebody had to be awake in it, and for 125 days somebody always was. Word got out to the country in the second week of January the way word does, which is not by anybody announcing anything. 2 Bohemian families on the West Bank had been grinding at Turkey Creek since June and had never stopped, and a German family north of the ridge came down on the 9th of January with 11 bushels on a hand sled because their horses were poor, and went home with flour and told a neighbor, and by the 15th of January there were 9 sleds in that yard. By the 1st of February there were 30 a day, and they were coming from Kelso Ridge, 12 miles, and from the state line 16. By the middle of February, after Teal's flu sheet went, they were coming from places that had no business coming, and there were sleds in that mill yard at 4 in the morning, with the horses blanketed and men sleeping in the boxes under buffalo robes waiting for daylight, and the line, on the 25th of February, 1881, stood at 41 sleds and reached from the mill door up the pitch and out onto the tableland. Here is what Melinda Prine did about that, and it is the part of the story that people in that county argued about for 50 years, because a certain kind of man could never be brought to believe it. She did not raise her toll. 1/10 in July of 1880 when there was no reason to be generous, and 1/10 in February of 1881 when she could have had 1/3 and nobody could have said a word. Roscoe Kim's daybook has every entry of that winter in it, and the museum at Renshaw has the book. And it is 1/10, 1/10, 1/10, down 1,100 lines. She did make 4 rules, and she made them on the 18th of January, and she made them stick. The first was that no household got more than 14 days of flour at a time, not because she doubted anybody, but because a family that has 100 pounds of flour in the house in a hungry country starts to be afraid of its neighbors, and she wanted the fear out of it, and she said so out loud in that yard about 200 times that winter. You will get more. You will get it in 2 weeks, and I will be here. The second was that nobody was ground out of turn, and she meant nobody. And this is where a bank director from Renshaw, who had driven 11 miles in a cutter, got told to go to the end of the line on the 9th of February in front of 30 men, and went. The third was that she took her toll in wheat, not in cash, all winter, from everybody who had wheat, and that she took nothing at all from any family that came with less than 4 bushels, and she never explained that rule to anybody and never wrote it on the board, and everybody worked out what it meant. which was that if you were down to your last few bushels, you ground free and did not have to say so. And the fourth was that the mill ground for the county before it ground for Melinda Prine, and her own tenth was ground last, at night, after everybody was gone, and a good deal of it was ground into flour that went right back out of that yard the next morning to a family that had nothing, and there is no record of any of that anywhere, because she kept it in her head on purpose. The work of it was inhuman. 6 bushels an hour is a mill running perfectly with full water and a fresh dress. A 4-foot stone under that kind of duty needs dressing every 11 or 12 days, and a dressing is 2 days on your knees, and she could not stop the mill for 2 days. So she dressed the bedstone at night with a lantern and the runner turned off, in 4-hour pieces over a week at a time, and then swapped and did the other, and by the end of that winter her right hand from the wrist to the second knuckle was so thick with new steel that Hetty Dowd said it looked like the hand had been dipped in pepper. She was up at 3 every morning to clear the rack. That is the detail from that winter that people who were children then still repeated when they were 80 years old, because the ones who slept in their father's sleds in that yard woke up in the dark and saw it. A lantern moving inside the mill at 3 in the morning, and the shape of her at the rack bar, hauling Brazil ice out of the head race every night all winter and going back in. Roscoe Kim slept on the meal floor. He slept on a straw tick laid directly on the boards over the husk frame, and the reason he is on the marker at that mill site along with her. A stone run, empty rings, and sparks, and burns a mill down. In a busy winter with wheat coming in a hopper, can run out at 3 in the morning, and a person can be asleep 11 feet away and never wake. Because a mill's roar is the same roar it has been for 19 hours, and a sleeping miller does not hear a change in it. But a stone running empty does something else besides ring. It changes the tremble in the floor sharply in about a second and a half, because the load comes off the gearing and the whole mill lightens. Roscoe Kim could not hear one thing on this earth. He slept with his whole body on the floor above the gearing for 125 nights, and in that winter he came up off that tick 11 separate times out of a dead sleep and got to the hopper before the stone had run empty for more than a few seconds. The 11th time was the 26th of February, and the tick was smoldering. He got the gate shut and got the runner off and threw the whole tick and half a barrel of water down onto the stone, and Melinda Prine came down the loft ladder into a mill full of steam and burnt straw, and looked at the stone face, and looked at him, and put both her hands flat on either side of his face for a second, which was the only time in 43 years she ever touched him, and then they cleaned up the mess and ground until dark. The storms were the other thing. There were 9 blizzards between the 4th of January and the 12th of April, and the worst of them was the 2nd and 3rd of March, and the one that mattered to this story was the 28th of January, 1881. It came up out of a clear noon in about 20 minutes, which is the kind that kills people, and it caught 11 sleds strung out along the Tableland Road between Kelso Ridge and the mill, and it caught 2 of them within a half-mile of the Turkey Creek pitch, and in that country, in a wind like that, a half-mile is exactly as far as 100 miles, because a man cannot see his own team, and there is nothing to steer by, and the road fills in behind him, and he will walk in a circle until he lies down. The Turkey Creek mill had a bell. It was not a bell. It was a locomotive tire 4 feet across that Ivor Dahl had hauled out from the Hesper scrap in October for nothing, because she asked him to, and it hung on a frame at the corner of the mill on the Tableland side, and when you struck it with a hammer it could be heard in still air for 2 miles. Melinda Prine put Roscoe Kim on that tire at 10 minutes past 1 in the afternoon of the 28th of January with a sledge, and he stood there in a Nebraska blizzard and struck it twice, waited while he counted 100, and struck it twice again, and did that without stopping for 5 hours and 40 minutes until dark, with his hands wrapped in sacking and his coat filling with snow, and she came out every half hour and turned him around and beat the ice off him and gave him coffee and made him move his fingers and sent him back. 11 sleds came down that pitch that afternoon, Every one of them came in on the sound. The last one in was a man named Vitus Sedlacek, who was František's second son and who had a load of wheat and 2 other men's boys in the box with him, and who had been going in a circle for an hour and 10 minutes and had already turned the horses loose in his own mind, and he said afterward, in the county history, in his slow, careful English, that what he heard first was not the bell, but the pattern of it. 2 strikes and a long count. 2 strikes and a long count, which is not a thing weather does, and that he understood in that second that somebody who knew exactly how lost he was had been standing out in that storm hitting a piece of iron for hours on the chance that he was alive. And on the 22nd of February, 1881, at about 11 in the morning, 4 sleds came down the Turkey Creek pitch in a line with Lyman Teal walking at the head of the first team. He had walked it. He had walked the whole 5.5 miles from Hesper in front of his own horses because the road had drifted in again on the 19th, and the only safe way through was a man on foot ahead of the team with a pole. 3 of those sleds were loaded with other people's wheat, 61 families' worth of it, that had been locked in his mill since the 11th of February, and that he had spent 9 days getting hauled out and sorted and marked with the owners' names on stakes in the bags. The 4th sled was his own wheat out of his own bin. There were, by the day book, 29 sleds in that yard when he came down the pitch, and about 40 men in the yard and on the loading floor and in the doorway, and every one of them stopped. Melinda Prine came out onto the loading floor with a scoop in her hand and flour on her arms to the elbows and stood there. Lyman Teal took his hat off. He was 42 years old that winter, and he had lost weight, and he had a beard he had not had in the fall. And he stood in the snow at the foot of her loading floor with his hat in both hands in front of 40 men who had every one of them been in his mill 100 times. And he said, "Miss Prine, I have got 61 grists here that are not mine and cannot wait, and they are marked with the names, and I will pay the toll on the whole of it out of my own bin, and I will haul it back myself. And I have got a load of my own wheat, and I am asking to be put in the line." She looked at him for about 3 seconds. Then she said, "Set them off at the end, and give the names to the boy." And Lyman Teal said, "Where in the line does mine go?" And Melinda Prine said, "Where it comes." Roscoe Kim's daybook for the 22nd of February, 1881, has an entry that is one of the reasons that book is in a glass case in Renshaw. Between an entry for Sedlacek, F., and an entry for Zednik, J., in that boy's large, careful hand, there is a line that reads, "Teal, L, 42 bushels, toll 1/10. The same toll as everybody. Not a cent more and not a cent less, and no speech and no remark, and nobody ever heard her mention it afterward in her life." In February, his own wheat came to her stones, and it went through in its turn on the 24th of February at about 2 in the afternoon. And he was there, and he watched it go through, and he did not say anything either. And when it was bolted and sacked, he put it in his sled and hauled the 61 other grists back to Hesper over 2 days and gave every one of them to its owner and would not take anything for the hauling. He came back 9 more times that winter with other people's wheat. He worked in that mill yard, unpaid, on the 6th and the 7th of March, shoveling out the pitch with 11 other men after the big storm. And on the 4th of April he asked her, privately, on the loading floor, whether she would take a partner with capital, and she said no, and he said I thought not, and that was the whole of that conversation, and they were, from that day until he left the county, on terms that were not friendship and were not anything else that has a name, but that were. Both of them being what they were, probably better than friendship would have been. There was one more thing that winter, and it was the worst of them, and it came on the 26th of February, 3 days after Lyman Teal walked down the pitch, and it had nothing to do with any person at all. The creek went down. People who have not lived on a prairie stream assume that a hard winter means high water, because they are thinking of snow, and they are thinking of snow melting. It does not work that way, and it works exactly opposite. A creek like Turkey Creek in an ordinary January is fed by 2 things, which are snowmelt from the tablelands and seepage out of the sandhill country to the northwest. And in a winter of that severity, the snow does not melt at all for 4 months, and the seep faces freeze and shut. And by the end of February, that creek was running on nothing but a handful of deep springs and about a third of what it had run in November. She saw it coming in the middle of February, the way she saw everything, which was early and in silence, by driving a willow stake at the water line at the head of the pond on the 9th of February and looking at it every morning. By the 26th, the stake was showing 4.5 inches of dry wood, and the pond had drawn down, and the head had gone from 4.5 feet to 3 feet 2 inches, and 11 horsepower had become about 6, and 6 will not turn a 4-foot stone under load and run an elevator and a bolter. And she knew within one morning that she was going to have to choose between grinding for 3 or 4 hours and then sitting with the gate half shut for 8 while the pond came back, or grinding all day at a speed that would make bad flour and would in about a week take the dress out of her stones. There were 38 sleds in the yard on the 26th of February. She stood at that willow stake in the morning for about a quarter of an hour, and then she came back up to the mill and got Roscoe Kim and a lantern, and went down under the meal floor into the kraal where the gearing was, and the two of them were down there for 2 hours. And when she came up, she had a piece of shingle with a drawing on it, and she sent a boy on a horse to Hesper with 2 lines written on a leaf out of the day book. The first line was to Elman Wick, and it said, "I need A gudgeon A&D 2 boxes, A&D A collar by Friday, A&D I will draw it for you tonight. Come down." The second was to Ivor Dahl, who was in town for the first time in 3 weeks, and it said, "I need every sound oak stick you can get on A sled A&D. I need it by Thursday. I have no money until July." What she had drawn on that shingle was a horsepower. The idea is old, and it is not clever, and every farmer in that county had seen one, because a sweep power is what ran a threshing machine and a corn sheller and a feed mill on half the farms in Nebraska. It is a heavy vertical post set in the ground with a great gear on it, and long wooden sweeps out from the post, and horses hitched to the ends of the sweeps walking in a circle, and a pinion taking the drive off that great gear, and a shaft carrying it away to whatever you want to turn. The clever part, and the part that no farmer in that county could have done, is the arithmetic that comes after. A horse walks at about 2.5 miles an hour. On a sweep with a circle 60 feet around, that is a little over 3 turns of the master wheel in a minute. A 4-foot burr millstone grinding wheat has to run at 125 revolutions in a minute. Not 110 and not 140. Too slow, and it will not throw the meal out to the skirt, and the stone chokes and heats. Too fast, and it throws the wheat through the furrows on ground and beats the flour instead of cutting it. So she had to take 3 turns a minute and make 125 out of them, which is a step up of better than 40 to 1 in a mill built to be driven by water, in a country with no foundry. In 10 days, in the last week of February in 1881. She got about half of it for nothing, because the mill was already full of gearing that was designed to do most of that job. The turbine drove an upright shaft with a great spur wheel on it, and the great spur wheel drove a small stone nut on the stone spindle, and that pair alone gave her something better than 7 to 1. She got the rest of it out of a mowing machine, a broken horsepower that had been lying behind Otto Hanselman's barn since 1876, and the wooden pattern shop that was her own head. Elman Wick came down on the 27th and stayed 3 days and never sent a bill for any of it. Ivor Dahl brought 2 sled loads of oak on the 3rd of March and 1 more on the 5th, and he had got it by going to 11 farms and asking, and by taking down a granary that a man at Kelso Ridge had built and never filled, with the man's blessing. František Sedlacek and his 4 sons dug the post hole through 4 feet of frozen ground with a fire and a bar over a day and a half. And on the 9th of March, 1881, in the mill yard at Turkey Creek, in snow up over the tops of the boots, with a temperature at 11 below zero, they hitched 8 horses to a sweep power and turned Absalom Prine's 4-foot, French burr stones with muscle. She had built it with 4 sweeps and 2 horses on each. She had built the sweeps 16 feet long out of oak because a long sweep is easier on a horse. She had set the whole thing far enough from the mill that the shaft ran in under the sill on a line of blocks and boxes that Almond Wick had made out of a wagon skein and 2 bearing halves off a mower, and she had a wooden clutch on that shaft. A simple dog clutch with a lever, so that the horses could be brought up to speed and then led into the gearing without shocking anything, and so that a horse going down would not tear the mill apart. It ground about 3½ bushels an hour. That is a little more than half of what the water gave her, and it was. In the 3rd week of a hungry march, in a district of 982 people with no railroad, the difference between everything and nothing. And here's the thing about that horsepower that is the true end of the story that started on the depot platform. And the county understood it perfectly at the time, and never afterward needed it explained. She did not own 8 horses. She owned none. The horses that walked that circle came from the farms. They came 2 and 4 at a time, on a list that Roscoe Kim kept and that Barbara Sedlacek organized in relays of 2 hours, day after day, from the 9th of March until the 28th, and they were fed out of the mill's own toll grain because a horse walking a sweep in 11 below zero has to be fed heavily, and their owners walked down with them and stood in that yard in the cold and drove them and walked them home. There were, in the end, by the list, 61 horses and 11 mules from 29 different farms. And there were 3 horses in that string that belonged to Lyman Teal and that he brought down himself twice a week, and there was one that belonged to Purdy Lovelace, the horse trader, who had stood on a depot platform in September of 1879 and told the town that she had fetched her own tombstones and had got the biggest laugh of his life, and who never once came down to the mill himself, but who sent that horse every week for 3 weeks with a boy. And who, when somebody in the Antelope bar asked him about it, said shut up, and did not drink there again for a month. That is what that yard looked like in March of 1881. 8 horses walking a frozen circle. A line of sleds up the pitch. A woman of 327 pounds standing at a hopper with flour to her elbows and a hand on the tentering screw, feeling the meal in her fist. A deaf young man on the bolter. Steam coming off the horses. Snow on everything for 11 miles in every direction. And, behind all of it, under the floor, 2 stones out of a quarry in France that a dying man in Illinois had cratered in oak and written a line inside the lid of. They ran that sweep for 19 days. On the 28th of March, a 2-day thaw put water enough in the pond to go back on the wheel, and it froze again, and they hitched the horses again on the 2nd of April for 6 days, and then the spring came for good. The last of the sled traffic was on the 12th of April. The road was open to Renshaw by the 21st. The first train came in on the 9th of May at 20 minutes past 2 in the afternoon with flour and coal and sugar and salt and mail that was 4 months old. The numbers of that winter are known exactly because Roscoe Kim kept the daybook and because the county went and got the daybook in 1912 and printed the whole of it. Between the 4th of January and the 9th of May, 1881, the mill on Turkey Creek ground 3,941 bushels of wheat, 406 bushels of corn, and 11 bushels of buckwheat, for 206 households in 4 townships and part of a 5th, and for 11 families across the state line who had no earthly claim on it. It ran on water for 88 days, on horses for 25, and was stopped entirely for repair for a total of 31 hours. There was no death from want in that district that winter. There were 4 deaths from cold. 3 of them stockmen caught out in the October storm before any of this began, and one an old man at Kelso Ridge in the March blizzard who went out to his barn and did not come back, and it is not honest to say that a mill saved anybody from those. It did not. But there were, in that district, 109 children under the age of 10 in 1881, and every one of them came out the other side of that winter, and in a country where the winter mortality of small children in a bad year ran to something a good deal worse than that. The men who wrote the county history in 1936 thought that was a fact worth setting down, and set it down. The other thing they set down, and it is the sentence that got repeated, is that in 125 days, with a line of sleds in her yard from January to April, and every family in 4 townships depending on her, Melinda Prine did not raise her toll by so much as a thimbleful, and did not take 1 cent in cash from anybody, and did not, on the record of 206 accounts, refuse a single grist that was brought to her door. And there was one thing more that they did not put in the county history, and that only came out at all because Hetty Dowd told it in 1904 to a woman who wrote it down. In the middle of February, when Teal's mill went down and the whole country came on to her, 3 men from the town rode out on the 15th to talk to her about it. They were the banker, the man who had the store, and Farrell Judd's father-in-law, and they came out with a proposition, which was that in an emergency of this kind a person holding the only mill was entitled to a fair return, and that if she went to a 3rd toll or even a quarter, nobody would say a word against her, and that they would put their names to it publicly to protect her from any talk, and that she could carry that money into a stock of machinery and a 2nd run of stone and never be poor again, and that they were saying this as friends and as businessmen and as men who had, several of them, not been as decent to her as they might have been in the past. They were in that mill about 40 minutes. They came out and rode back to Hesper, and the banker said, at supper to his wife, 1 sentence that his wife repeated to Hetty Dowd inside of a week, and Hetty Dowd kept it for 23 years. He said, she heard us all the way out, and she was civil. And then she said that when a man is hungry, the price of bread is the only thing he will remember about you for the rest of his life. And she said it did not matter what she charged this month. It mattered what they would say she charged in 1900. And then she asked us if we would mind carrying 2 sacks down to the sleds on our way out, and we did it. And it was not until I was a mile up the road that I understood she had made 3 of the leading men of that town haul flour for a Bohemian family for nothing, without one of us noticing. And I have not been able to think of anything else since. The spring of 1881 came all at once, which is what everybody who understood that country had been dreading since January. There were 4 months of snow lying on 4 townships, and there was frost in the ground 3 feet down. And when it went in a week, and every creek from the sandhills to the river came up at the same hour. The Missouri broke up in April of that year and took out towns, and that flood is in every history of the state, and the small end of it was that on the 18th of April Turkey Creek came down out of the tablelands 11 feet above its winter stage with ice in it and half a county of drift. Melinda Prine had built her dam for that morning. She and Roscoe Kim and Ivor Dahl, who had come down on the 16th with a sled load of oak and stayed, pulled the head gate at 4 in the morning of the 18th and hauled the trash boom out with the team and pulled every loose plank off the head race lid and stacked it on the bank above the dunt. High mark, and then they got up onto the tableland and watched. The water came over the crest of that dam in a sheet 9 days long. It came over it and ran down the 22-foot apron and went out into the tail without ever once falling free, and because it never fell free, it never dug. And because it never dug, there was nothing for it to get in behind, and the 16-foot spillway at the north end took the ice and the drift and let it go on down the creek, where it belonged. 200 yards below, in the willows, that creek moved 11 feet of bank and took out a wagon crossing and left a cottonwood log 4 feet through standing on end in the mud like a monument. On the 27th of April, when it went down, Ozias Sherrill's abutments had a new scour on the north one, and the head race lid was gone, and the plank facing on the upstream side was torn off for about 30 feet. The crib was untouched. Enos Baumgardner came down on the 2nd of May in a wagon at 76 years of age to look at it. And he walked out on that dam with a stick and stood on it a long while, and when he came back up, he said to František Sedlacek, who repeated it in his own English for the rest of his life. Anybody can build a dam. It takes a person who has been beat by water once in the family to build one this low. The Hesper Vedette printed the whole winter's arithmetic on the 19th of May, 1881, off Roscoe Kim's daybook with permission, and it ran a column and 3/4, and it was, as a piece of reading, extremely dull, and Judson Krieger knew it was dull and printed it anyway and said so in the second paragraph. He wrote that he was printing the dull part on purpose, because a thing like this turns into a legend in about 11 years, and a legend is no use to anybody, and because he wanted it on the record in figures while the people who had lived it were still able to check him, that no miracle had occurred on Turkey Creek, and that what had occurred instead was a covered head race, a low dam, a sloping trash rack, a set of stones dressed by hand every 11 days, a boy asleep on a floor, and 8 borrowed horses. And in the last paragraph of that column, Judson Krieger did the thing that cost him the most, and that is the reason his name is still on a plaque in that county. He set, in full, the heading his own paper had run on the 18th of September, 1879, which was Hyman's freight bill, and the 4 inches of column under it. And then he wrote, "That was set by me, in this office, in 1879, and I have had it in a drawer for 20 months. There is no way to unprint a thing. What a paper can do is print it again on purpose where everybody can see it, next to the account of what the lady has been doing since, and then let it be judged." This paper was wrong. It was not wrong in a small way, and it will not be excused in a small way. We had a look at a stranger getting off a train, and we made a joke about the shape of her. And the shape of her has kept 982 people in bread since January, and there is not one thing in this office that has been of any use to anybody at all. August Fenno pasted that column in the window of the store, and it stayed there through 2 owners and was still there, brown as tobacco, when the building burned in 1894. Now the summer. There is not a great deal to say about the summer of 1881, except that everything got easier all at once, which does not make good telling, but which was, for the woman it happened to, the whole of the reward. The crop of 1881 was the best that country had had, because 4 months of snow going into 3 feet of frozen ground is the finest thing that can happen to winter wheat, and the harvest came off in July, and it came to her. Not all of it, because a 4-foot run of stone cannot take all of anything, but as much of it as she could grind, from daylight until dark, 6 days a week, all through July and August and September, and she paid off Elman Wick. And she paid Ivor Dahl for the oak and had to argue with him about it. On the slate for 11 minutes, and by the 1st of October, 1881, Melinda Prine had, for the first time in her life, money in a bank. She had $611 in the bank at Renshaw. She wrote to her brother Wesley on the Illinois Central and told him. And the letter survives, and it is 4 pages long, and 3½ pages of it are about a bolting reel, and half a page is about everything else, and the sentence about the money is, "I have got $611 in the bank at Renshaw, which Father never had at one time in his life. And I would give the whole of it to have him stand in this mill for 1 hour and hear it run." Lyman Teal put a new flue sheet in his boiler in June and ran again from the 4th of July and took toll of 1/10 and never again in his life took a nickel more from anybody, and ground the merchant trade and the big custom loads that were more than she could handle and made money, and the 2 mills ran 5½ miles apart for 2 years and never once undercut each other, and there is a receipt in the museum from August of 1882 showing that when her stones needed a new pair of gate rods, she bought them out of his shop at his cost. He sold the mill in the spring of 1883 and went to Lincoln and into the grain business, and did very well, and married a widow from Beatrice in 1886 and had 2 sons. And he never came back to Hesper except twice, once for a funeral and once for something else that will come at the end of this. And in the middle of all of that, on the 14th of August, 1881, at about 8 in the evening, in the mill, With the water shut off and the last of the daylight coming in the west window through about 100 years of flour dust, Melinda Prine asked Ivor Dahl to marry her. She did it because she had worked out, sometime in the spring, that he was never going to be able to do it, and not because he did not want to. A man with a stammer of that kind can carry on a trade and drive a team and buy and sell and live a whole life. And there is exactly one sentence in the English language that he cannot say, and it is the one where everything is at stake, and there is another person's face 11 inches away waiting for the next word, and it locks a man shut like a hand on a throat. He had been 40 yards from asking her since about the second week of that march, and she had watched him get up to it and go away from it 4 separate times, twice on the loading floor, and once at the tail race, and once in Hetty Dowd's eating house with a fork in his hand. And she was 26 years old and had spent her entire life around machinery that would not start, and had a very simple attitude about it, which was that you do not stand and look at a thing that has stuck. She said, "Mr. Dahl, I am going to talk for a minute, and I want you to let me get all the way through it." He put down what he was holding. She said, "I have got a mill and a dam and 41 acres of willow and $600 and no house. I have got a bad knee and a worse one coming, and I am 327 pounds, and I have been that or near it since I was 19, and I am not going to be less, and if that ever comes to matter to you, it had better matter now and not in 11 years. I am not a pretty woman, and I have never had 1 hour of anybody courting me, and I do not know how it is done, and I am not going to learn it at my age. And I know what you are, and I have known it since the 9th of April of last year, when you walked backward down that pitch for 1/4 of a mile without ever once taking your eyes off my wheel, and there is not a man in this county I would rather have in a bad place. And I have been watching you try to get at this since March, and it is not going to come, and I would rather ask than lose it. So I am asking. And you do not have to say anything at all. You can write it, or you can nod your head, or you can walk out that door and take the sled up to Kelso Ridge and never come back, and I will not say one word to you about it ever again as long as I live, and we will go on the same as we were." Ivor Dahl stood there. He got as far as the first sound of her name and stopped on it, and stood with his mouth open for what he said afterward was the longest piece of time in his life, and his face went red and then white. And he could not do it. And he could not do it. And he could not do it. And then he turned around and put his hand flat down on the top of the meal chest, which had a 1/4 inch of flour dust on it the way every flat surface in that building always did, and he drew one word in the dust with his finger in letters 6 inches high. The word was yes. And Melinda Prine looked at it for a second and then put her own hand down in the flour beside his and wrote underneath it in the same dust one word, which was good. They were married in the mill on the 11th of September, 1881, which was 2 years to the day from the platform. And she chose the date and said nothing about why, and everybody knew. Reverend Pitkin came down from Hesper. There were, by the count in the vidette, 391 people in that mill yard, which was more than lived within 11 miles of the place. And they came in wagons from Kelso Ridge and from across the state line. And Barbara Sedlacek and 9 other women had been cooking for 3 days. And Hetty Dowd shut the eating house, and Farrell Judd shut the depot, and Almon Wick shut the shop. The ceremony was held on the meal floor, standing on the boards over the husk frame with the stones directly underneath them. And for the whole of that ceremony, 1 hour exactly, the mill was stopped. That is the only hour that mill was stopped in the entire year of 1881 outside of 31 hours of repair. And the guests knew it. And there is an account by a woman named Feltner who was there at 19 years of age, and who wrote it down in her old age. And she said that what she remembered was not the words and not the bride's dress, which was gray, and not the food, which was enormous, but that when it was over, Ivor Dahl walked over to the wall and pulled the lever on the headgate himself, and the water came down the race. and the floor came alive under 391 pairs of feet, and everybody in that building felt the stones take up at the same second, and there was a noise out of that crowd that she said she could still hear at 81 years of age. Roscoe Kim gave the bride away. He was 20 years old. Somebody had got him a coat. They built a house that autumn on the bench above the mill, 4 rooms and a lean-to, and Ivor Dahl built it, and the door frames in that house were made 11 inches wider than the standard because he made them that way without ever discussing it with anybody. And the chairs in that house were all built by him to one measure, low and wide and braced across the back legs, and there were, in the end, 11 of them scattered around that county, in the store and in the bank and in Barbara Sedlacek's kitchen and by the church door, and one at the head of the mill's loading floor that no other person ever sat in, and the last of them is in the museum at Renshaw with the seat worn through. They had 2 children, a daughter born in 1883 and a son in 1886, and the daughter was named Barbara and the son was named Absalom. The mill ran for 43 years. She put in a second run of stone in 1884 and a new turbine in 1889 and a partial roller plant in 1896, 4 brake rolls and a purifier, because the roller mills had taken the merchant trade everywhere in America and there was no arguing with it. But she kept 1 run of the French burrs to the very end for cornmeal and for graham flour, and she kept them dressed by hand every 11 days for 43 years, and there were people in that county in 1920 who would drive past 2 roller mills and 11 miles of good road to get cornmeal off Melinda Dahl's stones, and there were people in Omaha who ordered it by the barrel. She never raised her toll off 1/10. Not in the panic of '93, not in the drought years, not in 1918 when flour was worth what it was worth. She was on the school board from 1888, and she got the district a second teacher in 1891 by a method that involved no speeches at all and that 3 men on that board never entirely understood. And in 1894 she went to Lincoln and testified before a committee of the legislature about the milling tolls, at her own expense, and was asked by a member of that committee, in a tone he undoubtedly thought was pleasant, whether a lady understood what a bushel of wheat weighed. There is a stenographer's record of what she said next, and it was reprinted in 4 newspapers. She said, 60 pounds, sir, and a bushel of corn is 56, and a bushel of oats is 32, and a barrel of flour is 196 pounds net, and the tare on a cotton sack is 4 ounces, and on a jute sack is 9, and my father taught me those before I could read, and I have got about 11 pounds of steel in my hands from dressing the stones I ground them on, and I would be glad to show it to the committee. And then I would be glad to answer the question you meant to ask instead of the one you asked. Roscoe Kim was head miller at Turkey Creek from 1902. He married a deaf woman from Fremont in 1898, whom he met through a paper for the deaf that Melinda Dahl had subscribed to in his name in 1889 without telling him. And they had 4 hearing children, and every one of those children signed before they spoke. And the 4th of them, a girl, went to the state university and came back a teacher and taught in that county for 31 years. He ran the mill until it closed, and he died in 1941. Ivor Dahl freighted until 1900 and then quit the road and farmed the tableland above the mill and hauled for the mill only, and he never got much better at talking and did not need to, and he died in 1928 at 82, in the chair on the loading floor in the afternoon with the stones running. Lyman Teal died in Lincoln in 1915 at 76. Hetty Dowd died in 1896 at 77 and left the eating house and everything in it to a Bohemian girl who had washed dishes for her for 6 years, and the will was contested by a nephew from Iowa, and Melinda Dahl paid the lawyer. Purdy Lovelace died drunk in 1891. Enos Baumgardner died in 1887 at 82, and he had gone down to that mill on a Thursday afternoon 2 or 3 times a month for 6 years, and had sat in one of the wide chairs, and had watched, and had said almost nothing, and there is a note in the day book on the day of his funeral in Roscoe Kim's hand that says only, No grinding today. The mill on Turkey Creek made its last commercial grind on the 9th of November, 1924. Melinda Dahl was 69 years old, and her knees had been finished for 15 years, and she got around the mill on 2 sticks and a rail her husband had put up along the meal floor wall in 1911, and the roller mills and the trucks and the good roads had done what everybody knew they would do. And she was for it. And she said at the last meeting of the County Millers Association in 1923 that a custom mill was a piece of a road, and that a better road had come, and that anybody who would hold a county back to protect their own living had no business having had the mill in the first place. She died on the 3rd of February, 1931, at 76 years of age, in the house on the bench, in a blizzard, and they had to put the funeral off 3 days because the road was shut, which everybody present thought was about right. There were people standing outside that church in the snow because there was no room in it. The County Museum at Renshaw has one case for her. There is the chest of tools in it, with the 12 mill picks and the fitted rack and the proof staff and the straight edge that her grandfather made in Ohio in 1830. There is a cotton flour sack, printed Turkey Creek Mills, M. Dahl, 1/10. And the sack is the only advertising that mill ever had. There are the day books, all 43 of them, open to the 22nd of February, 1881, at the line that reads TLL 42 bushels, toll 1/10. There is a photograph taken in the mill yard in March of 1881 by a man from Renshaw with a wet plate camera, showing 8 horses on a sweep in the snow and a line of sleds going up the pitch behind them, and in the doorway of the mill, out of focus, very large, a woman with her hands white to the elbow. And there is a piece of oak board about 4 foot long, split off the lid of a packing crate, with a line on it in carpenter's pencil in a hand that is not hers. The card beside it says only that it is the lid of one of 2 crates shipped from Fairfield, Illinois, to Hesper, Nebraska in September of 1879, and that the writing is that of Absalom Prine, millwright, of Wayne County, Illinois. The line says, "These ARE good stones, A&D somebody, will be glad of them." The county history was written in 1936 by a committee of 5. And 2 of the 5 were children who had ridden into that mill yard on a sled in the winter of 1881, and they printed the day book, and they printed the vedette column, and they printed the list of the 61 horses and 11 mules, and the 29 farms they came off of, and at the end of the chapter they printed a letter. Lyman Teal had come back to Hesper one time that was not a funeral, in the autumn of 1912, when he was 73 years old, and he had hired a rig at the livery and driven himself down to Turkey Creek, and he had sat in the yard in the rig for about a quarter of an hour and had not gone in, and had turned around and driven back, and had told nobody. Roscoe Kim saw him from the loading floor and knew the face and said nothing to anybody for 24 years. But Lyman Teal went home to Lincoln and wrote a letter to the Hesper Vedette, and Judson Krieger's successor put it in a drawer, and it came out of that drawer in 1936, and this is the whole of it. He wrote, "I am told that a history of the county is being got up. I have been asked by nobody to contribute to it, and I am going to anyway, and it will be the last thing I have to say about that place. There are men still living who were on the depot platform at Hesper on the 11th of September, 1879, and who heard what I said. I have been asked about it perhaps 40 times in 33 years, and I have never once answered. And I want it in the book, so that it is not left to be guessed at by people who were not born. I said, there has been a mistake. I have had 33 years to think that sentence over, and I want to put down that I was right. There had been a mistake. It was mine. It was the whole of the mistake, and there was no other part of it belonging to anybody else, and it was not that I had been deceived, because I had not been. And she had written me the plain truth about herself, and I have the letter yet, and it is a better letter than any I wrote her. The mistake was that I had a look at a person coming down a set of car steps and believed that I had learned something. I have thought about what I would have had if I had put my hand up that afternoon instead of taking it down, and it is not what people suppose. I would have had a wife I did not deserve, and I would have had a mill run by somebody who knew 10 times what I knew. And I would have been, in that county, a very small man standing next to her, and the truth is that I could not have borne it, and that is likely the real reason my hand came down, and I did not understand that for about 20 years. I want one other thing in the book. In the winter of 1880 and 81, my mill cracked a flue sheet on the 11th of February and could not be repaired, and there were 61 families' wheat locked in it. I hauled it down to her, and I hauled a load of my own with it, and I asked to be put in her line, and she put me in it where I came, and took the same tenth off me she took off a Bohemian widow with 4 bushels. Which was to say she took nothing off the widow at all, and she never spoke of it to me or to anybody else, then or since. Every mouthful of bread eaten in that district between the 4th of January and the 9th of May, 1881, came off 2 millstones that stood in the freight room of the Hesper depot for 7 months, because there was not a man in that town, myself first among them, who would haul them out. That is all I have got to say, and I would be obliged if you would print the whole of it or none of it. They printed the whole of it. And under it, the committee of 5 put 4 lines of their own, and those 4 lines are cut into the granite marker that stands today at the mill site on Turkey Creek, where the dam abutments are still in the bank, and the pond bed is a hay meadow, and the foundation stones are in the grass, and the tail race is a green ditch that a person can walk down in about a minute. The marker says, on this creek, in the winter of 1880 and 81, the stones did not stop. The joke, in the end, outlived nearly everybody who laughed at it, the way jokes do. Purdy Lovelace said on a depot platform on the 11th of September, 1879, in front of about 90 people, that the fat woman had fetched her own tombstones and had brought a pair of them because she would want the pair. Nobody in that county could stop repeating it for 15 months. And then a railroad shut for 125 days, and everything 982 people ate for 4 months came off those 2 stones, and after the spring of 1881 there is not one recorded instance of anybody in that county ever telling that joke again, not in a saloon, not in a store, not in a wagon yard, for 50 years. And when the county history came to write it down in 1936, the committee printed it in full, because they said a thing like that has to be printed exactly as it was said, or the rest of the chapter means nothing. And then they put 1 line under it, which is the last line of the chapter, and which people in that county still say to one another about all kinds of things, and mostly without any idea at all where it came from. They wrote, she never answered it, and she never had to, because the answer was 5.5 miles out of town, turning,